Welcome back. Well, this week, the head of ASIO, Mike Burgess, gave an historic speech on where we sit with terror in Australia. Joining us live now to discuss this is Greg Barton, counter-terror expert. Greg, thank you for your time. Now, in particular, Mike Burgess sought to highlight the influence of right-wing terrorism in Australia, in particular some extremist groups that has ASIO concerned.
That's right. It's interesting he only identified two areas of terrorist concern, the ongoing threat from Al-Qaeda and Islamic State, but right-wing extremism. He talked about Australians trying to travel overseas to conflict zones and being stopped from travelling. Not as great numbers as was happened with Islamic State, but a worrying development, he said.
And why do you think that is? Is it the growing influence of them? Is it more supporters in that area? Or is it the increased threat that there will be an attack carried out in Australia by right-wing extremists?
Well, as Mike Burgess indicated, we're seeing this as part of a global problem. Of course, it was a wake-up call for Australia, he said, with the Australian terrorists being involved in the Christchurch massacre. That really brought home the immediate nature of the threat. And he said we can expect either low-tech attacks with knives or perhaps vehicles, or possibly something sophisticated in future. So it's clearly got ASIO now very, very concerned. They were paying attention to this years before Christchurch, but Christchurch really brought it home.
Absolutely. And we also saw some reference to the threat of terrorism, saying that it's probable that there will be some kind of attack in Australia in the near future. Is that, I mean, that's got to be a cause for concern for any Australian. Yeah,
our terror alert level was raised in September 2014, and it's remained at that probable level ever since. In fact, Mike Burgess said that they're dealing with twice the number of terrorism cases today than they were a year ago. And that's remarkable when you think about the decline of what we see with the Islamic so-called state caliphate. Part of that probably is right-wing extremism. We certainly see in North America and Europe it's a rising problem. So the fact that the Director General and head of ASIO should speak to the public so directly about this should really get our attention.
It is really interesting even to see this speech happen. It's the first of what he says is going to be an annual address. It does indicate that ASIO is trying to take a step towards being more open.
Yeah, it's very much to be commended. I mean, previous Director Generals have done similar things, but it's only the Director General and their deputy who can speak openly to the public about being in ASIO, working for it, and what ASIO does. So it's really important when somebody like that speaks. And the delivery was frank, plain language, unpretentious. So I think that every single word was carefully crafted. So when the Director General specifically identifies right-wing extremism as a threat, we've got to recognise that there's a lot of careful analysis and thought behind that, and we are expected to pay attention.
From your perspective, do you think enough is being done to counter the threat of right-wing extremism?
Look, I think it's really good that ASIO is paying attention. We know that state and federal police are as well. But we can't really police our way out of terrorism problems. I mean, we certainly need the intelligence services, and it's wonderful that they disrupt attacks. But we need to get ahead of the problem and work upstream and try and prevent the recruitment process. That's not something that ASIO by itself or the police can do. One of the things we need to do is, and Mike Burgess referenced this, is close down the spaces in social media and online forums for extremist narratives that play into recruitment. But we also need to be there in the lives of the mainly young people who are being targeted by recruiters. They want to belong to something, to feel that they're part of a group. That's what the right-wing extremists do. That's what Islamic State does with recruitment. It would be smart for us to be offering an alternative. That could be sort of very modest things like community groups, sporting associations. That we really need to make an investment in that space because we spend scarcely any money on these preventative measures. We necessarily spend a lot of money on intelligence, as we have to do, but a bit more investment on preventative measures working across the whole of society would pay big dividends. That's certainly the lesson of Europe and other parts of the world.
Do you think enough emphasis is being spent on right-wing extremism, or have we been focusing too much on the threat of, as you say, Islamic extremism?
I think we've been lulled into a false sense of security. Certainly pre the Christchurch attack, we knew that there were annoying, ugly right-wing extremists, but they seemed pretty incompetent and disorganised. Christchurch shifted our perception, certainly in ASIO, as Mike Burgess said, but in North America, in the US particularly, almost all terrorism attacks in 2018, 48 of 50 attacks are linked back to various kinds of right-wing extremist groups. Proportion is not as great in Europe, and it's a different story here in Australia, but that's the trend. That's where we're heading. And yes, it means we really have been underestimating this threat, because it's a kind of toxic nationalism that's not unique to the white supremacist variety we see in Western democracies. We see in places like India or Myanmar, for example, really ugly communalism in the name of a majority group against minority groups. That's a threat for the entire world, including our region of Asia.
Greg Barton, thank you for your analysis as always.
Good to chat. Thank you, Eri.